My name is Frank Vitale. I am a historian as well as a archivist. I work at Millersville University, and tonight I'm here to talk um, a little bit about uh, a Indian boarding school that was located here in the state of Pennsylvania, that can tell us a lot about the history of not only the Native American boarding school system that operated in this country in the late 19th century, but also a little bit about our state's history. Um, and I'm not talking about the Carlisle Indian School. I know I am here in the belly of the beast in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, right? And you may have heard about the Carlisle Indian School before. You may have gone to lectures about Carlisle. But tonight I want to talk about the Martinsburg Indian School. Because I think that by comparing and contrasting Martinsburg and Carlisle, we can actually learn a lot, not only about each individual institution, but also learn a lot about the system in which they're operating in, especially the 1880s in the United States. Um, Before I do that, before I launch into things, I do want to share Millersville University's land acknowledgement just because so much of this work has been going on as part of my affiliation with Millersville. Without reading every single word, Millersville University is situated just on the other side of the Susquehanna River, just south of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, on the ancestral homelands of the Conestoga, the Susquehanna, the Shawnee, and many other groups. Really, central Pennsylvania is a crossroads of a variety of different indigenous groups at the time of European contact. And part of my work is really sort of tied into this goal of paying proper attention and doing the proper research into the indigenous history of the places that we all inhabit. The other thing that I want to note before I go too far into this is that some of what we'll be talking about tonight may be distressing. Please take care of yourselves in whatever way you may see fit throughout the presentation. I will also note this research does follow what are known as the 6 R's of Indigenous research, which was set out by Sosi et al., which is a research group sort of talking about how respectful research around topics like this should be done. So you will note, for example, that some of the records that are shown on the screen have been censored. This is at the request of the nations whose ancestors are being impacted by that, as well as the fact that all this research and everything that's come out of it has been shared back to the nations that have been impacted. That's a really important part of the work. The other thing that I'll note is that none of this could have happened without 2 very important collaborators, Jody Stauffer and Chloe Shirk, who are Martinsburg, Pennsylvania residents, who had an interest in this work, and for the last 6 years have really been helping me with all of this. So I presume that most all of us in the room are familiar with this man on the left. This is Richard Henry Pratt, if you're not. And the quick elevator speech about Pratt is that Pratt is a U.S. Army soldier turned warden for prisoners of war for the Indian Wars that are happening on the American frontier. Pratt is a member of a small group of individuals who, starting in the wake of the Civil War, start to believe that instead of using violence to suppress indigenous groups and really to help control indigenous resistance to land claims, that there might be another way to ease the path for settlers in the American West, and that is through education. By assimilating indigenous youth, you could, in effect, kill the Indian in him and save the man. This is a very famous quote by Richard Henry Pratt. It is very intimately connected with the Carlisle Indian School for a lot of reasons. And part of that is because Pratt goes on under this mentality and with the support of the federal government to found the Carlisle Indian School just, a mile or so down the road. Pratt founds the Carlisle Indian School in 1879. Um, and there's three things that I want you to take away from this. This is not a, full history of the Carlisle Indian School. If you came here for that, catch one of my other talks another time. But the three things that I'd like you to take away. Number one is the fact that the Carlisle Indian School is situated on a set of abandoned barracks that are outside of the center of Carlisle proper. So this is now where the U.S. Army War College is. It is part of the borough of Carlisle, but the town itself, the sort of downtown area that we're now in, is not where the Carlisle Indian School is located. The second thing I want to note is the population of Carlisle around the time of the founding of the Carlisle Indian School. So in 1880, during the decennial census, Carlisle's population is approximately 6,200 individuals. That is appropriate for a county seat around this time in central Pennsylvania. And then the third thing that I want to note is that basically from the beginning, Pratt has a diverse and increasingly diverse set of students at his institution. And by that, what I mean is that the children that are at Carlisle are coming from numerous different indigenous nations and tribes from across the American frontier. And this is very important to Pratt. He believes that this is part of the goal of assimilation, is to make it so that English is the only language by which these individuals can communicate with one another. And that does have an impact on the comparisons between Carlisle and Martinsburg. Going back to Pratt, though, I want to share one of his lesser-known quotes. So, everyone knows the "kill the Indian in him and save the man" quote, but in a speech a few years after Pratt opens the Carlisle Indian School, he makes this argument to a conference of religious leaders. He says, quote, "In Indian civilization, I am a Baptist, because I believe in immersing the Indians in our civilization, and when we get them under, holding them there until they're thoroughly soaked." Now, I could spend the next 45 minutes just talking about this quote, right? There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of forceful language. There's a lot of religious imagery, obviously, here. But what I want to focus on are those last two words, thoroughly soaked. Pratt had this vision of being able to not use violence, but rather use education to suppress indigenous resistance to land claims. Carlisle could not do that alone. A single school could not do that alone. The vision that Pratt and individuals like him put forward was not a single school, not a small nucleus of schools, but rather a very large network, which would have then made it possible for generations of indigenous children and then adults to be assimilated into the culture of the Euro-American polity. And so that's what ultimately develops. So this is a map from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. This is an advocacy group that looks at the history and legacy of the Indian boarding schools in the United States. And it's very telling because their research, and this is as of just a few months ago, has identified over 500 schools that are part of a large system of schools across the United States and the American Empire that are all working under this same goal of assimilation through education. Now, it's fantastic to have this list because, going back into the past, lists like this, scholars were trying to build this out. NAPS has done a fantastic job with this. But unfortunately, most of these schools have not yet been investigated or studied beyond this identification. Dr. Preston McBride, who comes from Pomona College, brings this into stark relief. He notes that of all of these schools, 526, only 6 of them have been the subject of full-length books, and approximately a dozen additional schools have had some sort of a historical treatment, whether through an article or a magazine or something like that. So we really know very little about most of these institutions. And not only do scholars know very little, but the communities in which these schools were located and the indigenous populations and nations that they impacted also don't know a lot about their individual histories. So today I want to go some way to correcting that by looking at just one of those tiny entries down here at the bottom. This is Pennsylvania's list right there. By looking at Martinsburg. But in order to do so, we kind of need to think about this map and start putting it into categories. So scholars of the last few decades have been looking to try to unpack and understand that big map that I just showed you. And in doing so, identify a bifurcated or two-part system describing the schools that are part of this network. On the one hand, there are federally run schools. These are institutions that have a budget that is both provided and controlled by the federal government. These are institutions run largely by civil service employees. These are institutions that are very large in size and often enroll children from numerous nations and tribes. And these are institutions that are not officially religiously affiliated, but collaborate with multiple different church denominations. The Carlisle Indian School falls into this first bucket, as do schools like Chilocco, Sherman, Haskell, the big schools that you may have heard of. That's one side of the system. The other side of the system that these scholars identify are religious contract schools. So essentially, in the wake of President Grant's peace plan, different Christian denominations are separated out and assigned different reservations and indigenous communities that they are supposed to serve. And those denominations are then given per capita contracts by the federal government to establish schools. Those monies are then supplemented by funds from those religious congregations. Those schools are generally smaller. They're often tied to a single nation or tribe or to a single reservation. So their populations are generally not coming from all over the American Empire, just a small area. And the employees of these institutions were largely clergy or religiously affiliated lay people. Now, this model is what scholars have been putting forward for a few decades as the explanation for the two different types of schools that we just saw on that map. But there's a problem with this, which is that there's a big difference, or there's a big gap in which a variety of different schools fall into because they don't fall neatly into one of these two categories. The Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, for example, has identified nearly 100 schools that received no federal funding, at least according to available evidence. But it's also into this crack in the system that the Martinsburg Indian School falls. Martinsburg is an exception to the rule. It is a contract school with per capita quotas, but it is not religiously affiliated. In fact, it is expressly a for-profit institution. It only operates for 3 years, but Martinsburg breaks the mold that we previously saw. And so it's helpful to take a look at it and to think a little bit about its history because it can tell us a lot about not only Martinsburg, but also Carlisle and the broader system. So in order to talk about Martinsburg, we have to kind of go to Martinsburg, and instead of putting you all on a bus and driving you a couple of hours, it's easier to do it this way. So we're sitting right there where that red star is in the bottom section of this map of Pennsylvania, here in Carlisle in the Cumberland Valley. If we travel due west into the mountains outside of Altoona, Pennsylvania, in Blair County, we find ourselves in the town of Martinsburg. The town of Martinsburg is a small agricultural hub that is established after European settlement in the early 19th century. It essentially is a way station for agricultural products to come for local farmers to trade their goods, and then some of them will end up going down the road to Altoona to be traded in the larger marketplaces. In 1880, Martinsburg has a whopping 567 individuals living there, and all but a small handful come from a small area of European descent. So this is a very tight-knit community, and it is very different than Carlisle in 1880. It is not a county seat. It is not well connected with the surrounding area through things like train lines and communication lines and things like that. Martinsburg is very different. And in the center of Martinsburg, just a block or two from the main intersection of town, is a building that is known as the Juniata Collegiate Institute. They stopped building it in 1859, just 1 year before the Civil War, because they have great timing. And this building is built to be a school for the local population. But there are two problems with that. The first is that the economic outlook in the 1860s and the 1870s is not very good. The Civil War really wrecks the American economy. And the other issue with that is that the town of Martinsburg only has 500 and some people. It's kind of hard to run a school that is 3 stories and has all of these rooms and all of this space with just that small group of children. And so the building changes hands multiple times due to financial issues in the 1860s and 1870s. And it eventually ends up in the hands of the Breidenbach family. This individual, we will be talking about a lot. His name is Philip Howard Breidenbach. He styles himself as Professor Breidenbach. He comes from this prominent Breidenbach family, one of the top families in Blair County in this part of Pennsylvania during this period. Philip is actually educated at the Juniata Collegiate Institute while it's under the ownership of another family, another individual. And then Breidenbach goes on to complete his undergraduate and then graduate studies at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, just down the road from where Millersville University is. Breidenbach returns to the Martinsburg area in 1875, and he takes over this school on behalf of his family. And Breidenbach faces the exact same financial issues that previous owners of the institution have faced. Namely, the economic output is not good, and there's not enough children to educate. Well, around 1880 or so, Pratt's general idea of having schools to educate indigenous youth is really starting to gain traction with political support in Washington. Multiple different schools are established, and by the middle of the 1880s, the federal government is now interested in establishing additional schools that they're not running, they're just providing contracts for. This is where the religious contract schools come in, because the denomination network that is established is a really good way to set up those schools. And Breidenbach realizes, well, wait a minute. They will give me money to educate children that aren't here already. This is a way to save my institution. So Breidenbach reaches out to his family's network of supporters. He reaches out to political figures in the state of Pennsylvania. This is former Governor Andrew Gregg Curtin on the left. He reaches out to colleagues from his previous days in schooling. In the middle is Thomas Gilmore Apple, who at the time is the president of Franklin and Marshall, where Breidenbach had completed his undergraduate and graduate studies. And he reaches out to Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, who has very significant sway in Washington, and corresponds with Pratt enough to get Pratt's approval for Martinsburg existing. At most, Pratt's approval is sort of lukewarm, and we'll get back to that in just a little bit. But Breidenbach gets letters of support from all these individuals, has people in Washington lobbying for him, and in early December of 1884 sends a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who's in charge of the system of boarding schools, and asks for a contract. By the end of the year, he is granted one. So in a day where this letter has to go by horse to a rail station, down to Washington, through the bureaucracy of Washington, and back again, within less than a month, Breidenbach is awarded a contract for a school. Now, initially, Breidenbach is not too pleased with this contract. He's annoyed by the terms of it. It says that he can only educate a maximum of 100 indigenous children. And it specifically says these children must be either Osage or must be Oneida from the Green Bay Reservation. He's given these sort of very narrow parameters by which he can find students for his school. And he also feels like he's not getting paid enough per student. But Breidenbach basically accepts the contract and writes back and says, "Thank you so much, I'll accept the contract, send them over." It's not really how the system worked in this period. Breidenbach anticipates that the students are going to be furnished to him by the federal government. And in actuality, the federal government isn't doing that. That's not how these schools are operating anywhere. And this is just one of those early hints of Breidenbach's potential misunderstanding of what it meant to have a boarding school and the federal government's expectations for it. Instead, Breidenbach goes about to enroll indigenous children in the ways that we see as very common at Carlisle. So Breidenbach goes out to the Green Bay Reservation and enlists the help of missionaries on the reservation, Indian agents, tribal police, to try to recruit, using the language of the day, children to come to the Martinsburg Indian School. We know from the scant surviving records that while some children and some parents of children may have voluntarily signed up to be affiliated with the Martinsburg Indian School, others did not. Before Breidenbach even leaves Green Bay, his initial population of 50 children that he's identified has dwindled to 49 because somebody's already deserted the group. So Breidenbach's already not off to a good start. But he brings these 49 Oneida children to Martinsburg. For the Osage, however, Breidenbach does have a little bit of assistance in the fact that all of the Osage children that come to the Martinsburg Indian School are sent directly from Carlisle. Richard Henry Pratt is ordered to take all of these Osage children that are already at the Carlisle Indian School, and they are already in the middle of a multi-year course of study, and send them to the Martinsburg Indian School. We're not entirely sure why this is the case, but we have a pretty good guess, and it has to do with money. So the Osage Nation have what are known as the Osage Trust Funds. This is a set of money and resources that is administered by the federal government on behalf of the Osage. And at the time, the ruling was that Osage children the Osage Fund could not be used to pay for Osage children that were in federal schools like Carlisle, because Carlisle's money came from existing appropriations. However, if those same Osage children were in a contract school, the Osage Trust Fund could be used to pay for their education. So, by taking the Osage children that are at the Carlisle Indian School and transferring them to Martinsburg, Pratt now has additional space at Carlisle for additional Indigenous children, and the federal government can use the Osage funds to pay their way at Martinsburg. And this is underlined by the fact that Breidenbauer gets more money for each Osage child that is enrolled at the school than he does for each Oneida child. So again, following the money tells us potentially why that difference sort of exists. Either way, we know that even though Breidenbauer is contracted to have 100 students at the school, he only ever has a maximum of 91 children enrolled at Martinsburg at any one time. That's also a high watermark. This picture we can actually date relatively easily to May of 1886 because of the number of children that are in the photograph. This is the only surviving image from the Martinsburg Indian School. I use it again and again because it's the only visual we really have. And that's also important to note that that's 91 children in a town that is 567 residents. So that's a seventh of the local population are now Indigenous children, which is very different than the demographics, even here in Carlisle, even when the Carlisle Indian School is at its high watermark. As far as student life, from what we can tell from the surviving records, student life at Martinsburg is very similar to Carlisle and other boarding schools of the time. We know, for example, that there are compulsory religious activities, including Sunday services, baptisms, holidays, and things like that. We know that at Martinsburg there is a student literary society that is modeled off of the literary society here at the Carlisle Indian School. And at that literary society, the students could practice rhetoric, they would have a way to engage with each other outside of the classroom. But we also know that there are some differences between life at Martinsburg and life at Carlisle and other schools. We know that there are many interactions with the local town residents in the town of Martinsburg. Again, this is facilitated by the fact that not only are the students a significant part of the local population, they're in the center of town. Unlike at Carlisle, where the barracks is a little bit of a ways away. So we know that there are many casual interactions on a day-to-day basis between the children at Martinsburg Indian School and the local town residents. We know that there are children that are going to the local shops. We know that they are playing pranks on the local townspeople, sometimes with the local town's children helping them. We know that the children at the Martinsburg Indian School and the local town's children played together. We also know that there are very formal types of town interaction. We know that the students of the Martinsburg Indian School, for example, will put on exhibit at county fairs. We know that they were part of parades for the town. We also know that student life at Martinsburg included elements of resistance. This is very common at all Indian schools, where the students, the children, are in some way, shape, or form resisting the institution in which they've been placed. Sometimes this is passive, things like making fun of their teachers, wasting time, wasting resources, refusing to do tasks. And sometimes this is very active forms of resistance. At Martinsburg, for example, it's very easy for you to speak your own language to your classmates, which is something that's not allowed at schools, including in Carlisle. But at Martinsburg, the difference is if you're an Osage student speaking Osage, half of the student population will understand you. English does not need to be the common language when the children can communicate amongst themselves relatively easily as a form of resistance, and they can speak with a large proportion of their classmates. We also know that students at Martinsburg openly defied their teachers and administrators up to and including threats of violence, which made their way into local newspaper stories that then got caught up by the national press. And like at all Indian schools, we know that students that were at Martinsburg deserted the school and ran back home, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, sometimes they were caught and brought back. But the sheer act of deserting the Martinsburg school not only is an action of removing yourself from the situation, but also hurting the school's bottom line. It's a per capita contract. So you're sort of sticking both of your fingers in the eyes of Breidenbau and the school's administrators. When we look at the curriculum between Carlisle and Martinsburg, we know that it's again very similar. Breidenbau models his curriculum off of Carlisle's. Christianization is a overarching umbrella under which religion is used as a means of assimilating indigenous youth, but again is not denomination specific. We know that in a standard academic day, about half of your time would be devoted to academic training, things like reading, writing, and arithmetic. That was, again, focused solely on Euro-American topics, and indigenous knowledge is very much set to the side and ignored and actively erased as part of that. And then we know that there's a half day of industrial training. And like at Carlisle, that is a very gender segregated thing, where female students are learning domestic tasks and male students are learning agriculture, smithing, and trades such as that. But we know that the curriculum is actually modified at Martinsburg to make it more profitable. And the best explanation of that is through the outing system. So at the Carlisle Indian School, Richard Henry Pratt establishes what he calls the outing program. Under this program, Indigenous children are placed to live with local families across the region and beyond. And the goal is that this is further immersion in a white society, in a white household, in a Christian household. And as part of that outing, the child would be performing some sort of labor, either on a farm, in the house. And the key part of that for Pratt was that this is not only a means of reinforcing what is learned at the school, but it's also a way for the children on outing to learn about earning a wage. So outing patrons for children at the Carlisle Indian School pay those children a wage, and the school manages that money for them. And we can go into all the specifics of what that looks like at Carlisle, but again, that's not the point here. The point here is the distinction with Martinsburg. At the Martinsburg Indian School, children are placed on outings, but they don't live in their outing homes. Because the town is so small, the children come back and sleep and spend most of their evening hours at the school, and then go out to the households to perform the labor aspect of the outing program. So essentially, what Breidenbau's done is stripped away the immersion part and now created a day laborer system. And in addition to that, Breidenbau ensures that the patrons are paying for the work of the students that are working in their homes and on their farms and in their factories. But the children don't see that money. The school pockets that money. Breidenbau pockets that money. And perhaps even worse is the case of the spring-tooth harrow company. So a spring-tooth harrow, and I didn't know this, a spring-tooth harrow is this agricultural device where you can prepare a field for planting. And Breidenbau works with a few members of the town of Martinsburg to create a company to create these spring-tooth harrows. He then establishes that company by moving all of its operations into the new industrial barn that the students at Martinsburg have just built for the Martinsburg Indian School. And then the children at Martinsburg are learning how to blacksmith by making these machines and not being paid to do it. So Breidenbau is getting paid by the federal government to educate these children who are now providing free labor for a company in which he's a part owner. And they're housed on the grounds of the school. So obviously a very different way to run your industrial training program because now you're in a full profit system. And we know all of this partially from the scant surviving records, the newspaper articles, and things about the school. But we know about these things largely because of some very particular acts of student and parent resistance. So, this is a letter that is written by a student at Martinsburg to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And again, I'm not naming the individual at the request of the nation. Student letters like this are not very common, even within the records of the Carlisle Indian School, which are very well kept. This is the only letter that survives from a student at Martinsburg. But this letter is very revealing because the child is complaining about the way that things are running at the Martinsburg Indian School. They say, for example, that the students are getting poor and they work hard and they do not get paid for their work. They, more specifically, also indicate elements of passive resistance. They work hard, but they don't like to work when it rains. Again, withholding labor. We also have this child specifically calling out Philip Howard Breidenbach, saying P.H. Breidenbach always buys himself clothes and shoes that he wears every Sunday. And through the remainder of the letter, this student talks about how most of the children that are working in the fields don't have matching shoes because they've had to beg for them from the local townsfolk. How many of them don't have hats? And that some of the townspeople say that he cheats. And perhaps most interesting from a comparative standpoint is the fact the child that wrote this letter had previously attended Carlisle and says in black and white, at Carlisle, Captain Pratt always pays the boys that are working. During the time, the children at Martinsburg actively knew that they were having a different experience at Martinsburg than they would be having at Carlisle, right? This comparison in the day is very important because it's an act of resistance that this child is strong enough and assertive enough to write this letter. And this letter then creates a lot of headaches for Philip Breidenbach. He ends up getting an investigation sent to him by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It just starts to really create some problems. This then combines with acts of parental resistance. So on the left, we have a quote from a large group of Oneida parents, and on the right is a letter from an Osage parent, which again has had some redactions. So parents of children that are at Indian schools very frequently wrote to the administrators at the school and to the Bureau of Indian Affairs seeking to get their children sent back home. And they make a variety of different arguments to try to get that point across. Parents argue that the children are needed for work. They argue that family members at home are sick and they need the children to return. For that reason, they argue that the children themselves are sick. They argue that the school is unsatisfactory, that it's not doing what was promised, or that the terms of the enrollment were not what was promised. All of these arguments from parents as a form of resistance are found at Carlisle, they're found at many other schools, and they're found in the records at Martinsburg. The interesting thing at Martinsburg is that parents are increasingly successful in their arguments to the Bureau of Indian Affairs to force Breidenbach to send their children home. And again, sending children home not only removes the child from the situation, but also reduces Martinsburg's bottom line. The combination of parental resistance like this and student resistance like the letter I showed previously combine to reduce Martinsburg's total enrollment by over a third in the first year. This is much more successful of a tactic at Martinsburg because it's a smaller institution and because the institution is for profit. And so every time parents get together and ask for a dozen of their children to be sent back home, it creates a significant financial downside for the Martinsburg school. So Brian Bell is facing these declining demographics. He's facing the parent and the student resistance. He's also facing shifting political headwinds. So by the end of the 1880s, political conversations around the boarding school system start to shift. On one hand, you have individuals like on the left, this is Henry Dawes of the famous Dawes Allotment Act, who argue that it is altogether too expensive for the federal government to be running schools off reservations. It would be cheaper and easier and less complicated logistically to have these schools located on or near the reservations. Dawes is joined by a separate faction of politicians who take issue with the fact that the contract system has basically become a way for the federal government to award contracts solely to religious institutions. And so, politically, the battles that are happening in Washington in the late 1880s are going against the contract system that Martinsburg operates on, and the very type of school that Martinsburg is as an off-reservation school. At the same time, Breidenbauer manages to make an enemy of the man that he probably should have kept as a supporter, Richard Henry Pratt. Pratt very quickly turns sour on Breidenbauer. He's seeing newspaper articles about all of the issues at the Martinsburg school, threats of violence, students deserting, all of these different things, and it's hitting the local press in Pennsylvania and then spreading out from there across the nation. And Pratt's learning about all of this. He's hearing from other individuals that are connected with the Martinsburg school. And Pratt basically finally writes to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and says, look, Breidenbauer's got to go. This guy's mercenary. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's just in this for the money. He's making a mockery of the whole thing. This isn't working. You got to shut it down. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs does so, about as unceremoniously as they started the Martinsburg Indian School with the awarding of a contract. The Bureau of Indian Affairs sends a telegram to Philip Howard Breidenbauer and says, your contracts are not going to be renewed for the following year. Breidenbauer is given a very short window in which he can close the Martinsburg Indian School. And then the story goes from both Pratt's correspondence and from Breidenbauer's correspondence that Richard Henry Pratt takes the train out to Martinsburg and he assembles all of the children in the main assembly hall of the school. And he makes an impassioned speech about the value of education and implores them to stay east and to go to Carlisle instead. And then, according to Pratt, the children are given the free choice of whether to go back home or go to Carlisle. Obviously, we don't know what that conversation was like. We don't have the perspective of any students from that, of that event. What we do know is, one, according to all the ways that this story is told, the parents are never consulted. And two, that the end result of what likely was a little bit of a forced conversation, 2/3 of the students at Martinsburg transfer to the Carlisle Indian School, and the remaining third are sent home. And this is the end of the Martinsburg Indian School. It stops almost as quickly as it starts. It's only open for just under 3 years. And Breidenbauer's left with this much larger school. He's now built some outbuildings with the help of this unpaid student labor and has no students. And so he tries to open it up as a school again. Surprise, surprise, it doesn't really work. And so Breidenbauer tries a variety of different things. He tries to operate it as a hotel, as a seminary, as an almshouse. Breidenbauer also puts in an application to be the superintendent of an Indian school out in Oregon. Nothing really pans out. And the building eventually is torn down. It really never serves as a school building for any significant duration of time after this. So there are a lot of comparisons and juxtapositions we can make between Martinsburg and Carlisle. Again, the early years of Carlisle and all of the years of Martinsburg are happening during this nascent period in the federal government's attempts to have a broader system of education. This is the time when Pratt is further refining his curriculum. And at Martinsburg, we see a similar curriculum that has been modified to make it more profitable. We see a variety of different student experiences at the school because the children are in the center of town and make up a large proportion of the town's population. All of these town interactions, one might argue, lead to additional instances of student resistance. We also have Martinsburg operating on a smaller scale, with the compounding negative impacts of its for-profit aims on enrollment, student life, and other elements. The point here is that these are two schools in Pennsylvania educating some of the same children at the same time, very differently. The students' experiences are very different at these institutions. And so we need, when we're talking about individual schools, to paint with a finer brush when we're talking about what it's like at these institutions, because they're not all the same. The Martinsburg Indian School has an enduring legacy. For the Osage and the Oneida Nations, they are still working through and revitalizing in the face of intergenerational trauma from Martinsburg and other Indian boarding schools. You also have the town itself of Martinsburg, Pennsylvania, in which the Juniata Collegiate Institute was a piece of obscure folklore at one point, but is now really expanding into the public consciousness thanks to the work of my collaborators that are based in the town. And so this local historical understanding is really starting to bubble up and become supportive. And as part of all of this, there's now an increased public consciousness. In addition to all research, things like the repatriations, additional discoveries at other schools really brings up this public interest in the Indian boarding schools, which again underlines this need for responsible historical inquiry when we're doing this work and when we're talking about these schools. And that's because for us in Pennsylvania, this isn't a far-off history. So we have our map of Pennsylvania here. Pittsburgh is closest to me here in the west. Towards the east is Philadelphia. And we can plot the schools that we're aware of here in Pennsylvania. We have 3 schools that operate solely as Indian schools. That is, they're not educating any other groups of individuals. In the middle of the map, you have Carlisle. To the west, you have the Martinsburg Indian School, and in the middle of Philadelphia, you have the Lincoln Institute, which operated again for a shorter amount of time than Carlisle, but all of these schools are very close in their operations and in this sort of network. But these are not the only schools. We know of at least 14 institutions that are operating as schools that also have Indian students that are coming from Carlisle and Martinsburg and Lincoln. This includes Dickinson College and its preparatory school, as well as the Millersville State Normal School, the predecessor institution to Millersville University. We also know that there are at least 10 nursing schools that are located in hospitals across the state that had particularly female students going to become nurses in their programs. And we know that there are at least 2 institutions that try to become boarding schools, much like Martinsburg, but do not ultimately get a contract awarded to them. The point here is that it's not just Carlisle. The Carlisle Indian School is arguably the center of a wide network of institutions across the state of Pennsylvania and beyond. This map does not include the dozens, potentially hundreds of common schools and day schools and small public schools which hosted Indigenous children that were on Carlisle's outing program, for example. This is a huge network across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This is not just a blip in Cumberland County. This is a part of our Commonwealth's history, and it's something that, as a state, especially as we're coming to the 250th anniversary of the nation, it's important for us to recognize because this is part of our history. And while we know a lot about the Carlisle Indian School, by looking at other institutions like Martinsburg, we can start to learn more not only about the institutions themselves, but this much broader network in which they operated in Pennsylvania. Thank you so much.